The echo of a gunshot ricocheted through the dusty air of Republic, Washington, followed by a scream that stopped Callie Everett's heart cold. She had never imagined that a simple trip to town with her younger sister would end with blood soaking through her blue calico dress and pain searing through her shoulder like a hot poker. But as she crumpled to the ground in front of the general store, one thought consumed her mind. At least Abigail was safe. Republic was not a town where trouble typically found its way. Nestled in the eastern part of Washington Territory, in 1883, it was primarily a mining community where folks kept to themselves and violence was rare. The sisters had only moved there 6 months prior, after their parents' passing left them with nothing but each other, and a small inheritance that had purchased a modest cabin on the edge of town. Callie had been walking out of Whitman's general store, her arms laden with supplies, when she spotted 3 men harassing Abigail near the water trough. She had seen their type before, drifters looking for easy pickings in a town too small for a proper sheriff. When the tallest one grabbed Abigail's wrist, Callie dropped her packages and rushed forward without a second thought. "Take your hands off my sister," she had demanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The leader, a man with a pockmarked face and breath that reeked of cheap whiskey, had merely laughed. "Well, look here, boys. Seems we've got ourselves 2 for the price of 1. What happened next was a blur. Abigail broke free and ran behind Callie. The man reached for his pistol, cursing. Callie pushed her sister aside just as the gun fired. The bullet tore through her left shoulder, spinning her around before she collapsed into the dirt. Now, as she lay bleeding in the street, Callie could hear Abigail's desperate sobbing and the sound of retreating footsteps as the men fled. Black spots danced before her eyes, and she wondered dimly if this was how it would end her life, spilled out onto the dusty main street of a town that wasn't even home. "Don't move, madam. You've been shot." The voice was deep, assured, and oddly calming. Through her pain-filled haze, Callie looked up to see a man kneeling beside her. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw covered in stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. "My sister," Callie gasped, trying to sit up despite the agony in her shoulder. "She's right here," the man said, gently but firmly pressing her back down. "Don't try to move. I need to stop this bleeding." Callie felt him tear away the fabric around her wound, his movements quick but careful. She could hear Abigail crying nearby. "What's your name?" he asked, applying pressure that made Callie bite back a scream. "Callie Everett," she managed through gritted teeth. "My sister is Abigail." "I'm Jake Sutton," he replied, his voice steady as he worked. "Those men who shot you, they're part of the Reeves gang. They've been causing trouble throughout the territory." Callie barely heard him. The pain was becoming overwhelming and she felt herself drifting. She thought she heard him curse under his breath, but it seemed distant, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Stay with me, Callie." Jake's voice grew more urgent. "I need you to stay awake." She tried to focus on his face, but the edges of her vision were growing dark. The last thing she remembered before consciousness slipped away was the feeling of being lifted into strong arms and the scent of leather, horses, and something distinctly masculine that reminded her of the forests back home. When Callie next opened her eyes, she was lying on an unfamiliar bed in a sparsely furnished room. Sunlight filtered through a window covered with a thin curtain, casting a golden glow over rough-hewn walls. For a moment, she couldn't recall where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the pain in her shoulder flared and memory came rushing back. "Abigail," she called out, her voice little more than a croak. The door immediately opened and her sister rushed in, her face pale but eyes bright with relief. "You're awake." Abigail cried, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and taking Callie's good hand in both of hers. "You've been asleep for almost 2 days. I was so worried." Callie squeezed her sister's hand. "Are you all right?" "Those men, they're gone," Abigail assured her. "Mr. Sutton says they hightailed it out of town after you were shot." Her voice wavered slightly. "He brought us to his ranch, said it wasn't safe to leave us in town with those outlaws possibly coming back." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jake Sutton appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with a steaming cup and a bowl. He was taller than Callie had realized, his shoulders broad beneath a simple blue shirt. Without his hat, she could see that his hair was a rich brown, a shade darker than the tan that marked him as a man who spent most of his days outdoors. "Good to see you awake, Miss Everett," he said, placing the tray on a small table beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule," Callie admitted, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace as she tried to shift position. "But I'm alive, thanks to you." Jake shook his head. "No need for thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." "But they didn't," Abigail pointed out. Everyone else just watched. A shadow crossed Jake's face. "That's one of the problems with these frontier towns. People are often too afraid to get involved." He nodded toward the tray. "I've brought some broth and tea with willow bark. It'll help with the pain." Callie studied him as Abigail helped her sit up against the pillows. Jake Sutton didn't look like most of the cowboys she'd encountered since moving west. There was something in his bearing that suggested he'd had a different life before settling in Republic, perhaps education or a military background. His manner of speech was measured and more refined than the typical ranch hand. "You've done this before," she observed as he checked her bandaged shoulder with practiced movements. "Treated gunshot wounds, I mean." A small smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "I served as a field medic during the war. Picked up more knowledge about bullet wounds than I ever wanted to know." His fingers were gentle as they probed the edge of the bandage. "The bullet went clean through. You're lucky no bone was hit, though you lost a fair amount of blood. If you're careful and keep it clean, it should heal well enough." Callie nodded, wincing slightly as his examination triggered a fresh wave of pain. "Where exactly are we?" "My ranch, the Double S. It's about 5 miles outside of town." Jake stepped back, his expression turning serious. "I'm afraid your cabin might not be safe right now. The Reeves gang has been known to come back and finish what they start." Fear clutched at Callie's heart. "You think they might return for us? But why? We have nothing of value." Jake's gray eyes darkened. "Men like that don't need much reason." "You stood up to them, showed them up in front of the town. Some men take that kind of thing personally." Abigail's hand tightened around Callie's. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Before Callie could respond, Jake spoke. "You'll stay here until you're healed and we're sure the danger has passed. I've already sent word to the territorial marshal about what happened. With luck, they'll catch those men before they can cause any more harm." "We can't impose on you like that," Callie protested, though the thought of facing those men again made her blood run cold. Jake's expression softened slightly. "It's no imposition, Miss Everett. I have the space, and my foreman's wife is here to ensure all propriety is observed." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Besides, I promised Dr. Wilson I'd keep an eye on you, and he's not a man I care to disappoint." Callie wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was already pulling at her. The events of the past days had drained her more than she realized. Seeing her fatigue, Jake motioned to Abigail. "Perhaps we should let your sister rest. Mrs. Hendricks has prepared a room for you next door." His tone was kind but brooked no argument. Abigail looked reluctant but nodded. "I'll be right next door if you need anything," she told Callie, squeezing her hand once more before rising. As they moved toward the door, Callie called out, "Mr. Sutton." He turned, one eyebrow raised in question. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the medical care, but for taking us in. Not many would do that for strangers." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise or something deeper. "Get some rest, Miss Everett. We'll talk more when you're stronger." With that, he ushered Abigail out, closing the door softly behind them. Left alone, Callie sank back against the pillows, her mind whirling with questions about the taciturn cowboy who had saved her life and what would become of her and Abigail now. But the tea and broth, combined with her body's desperate need for healing, soon pulled her back into the embrace of sleep. The next week passed in a blur of pain, healing, and gradually increasing strength. Callie discovered that the Double S Ranch was larger than she had initially assumed, not the largest in the territory by any means, but substantial enough to employ half a dozen hands and run several hundred head of cattle. Jake Sutton, she learned, had acquired the property 3 years earlier after leaving his previous life in St. Louis. Mrs. Hendricks, the foreman's wife, was a cheerful, robust woman with capable hands and a no-nonsense attitude. She changed Callie's bandages daily, brewed herbal teas to help with healing, and kept Abigail occupied with tasks around the main house to prevent the girl from hovering too anxiously over her sister. Jake himself was something of an enigma. He checked on Callie's progress each morning and evening, his manner always professional and kind, but reserved. He spent most daylight hours out on the range with his men, returning dust-covered and tired, but he always made time to ensure his unexpected guests were comfortable. By the 8th day, Callie was able to leave her bed and move around the room without assistance. On the 10th day, Mrs. Hendricks helped her to the main living area of the ranch house, where she was able to take supper at the table with Abigail and Jake rather than eating from a tray in her room. "The color is returning to your cheeks," Jake observed as they finished a meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "Dr. Wilson will be pleased with your progress when he visits tomorrow." Callie smiled, feeling more herself than she had in days. "I'm grateful for everyone's care. I don't know what Abigail and I would have done without your help." Jake waved away her thanks as he always did. "Any news from town about those outlaws?" she asked, changing the subject. A shadow crossed his face. "Nothing definite. There have been reports of men matching their description causing trouble over in Colville, but the marshal hasn't been able to track them down yet." Abigail, who had been relatively quiet during the meal, looked up sharply. "So they're still out there, still free to hurt other people?" "I'm afraid so," Jake admitted. "The territory is vast and law enforcement is spread thin." Callie reached across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. "Don't worry, Abby, we're safe here." Jake cleared his throat. "Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss with you both." He set down his napkin and fixed Callie with a direct gaze. "I received word from Ben Wilson, he runs the boarding house in town, that someone broke into your cabin 2 nights ago. Nothing was taken, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" Callie prompted, a sense of dread building in her stomach. "They left a message, carved into your table. It said, 'We'll be back.'" Abigail gasped and Callie felt her newly recovered strength drain away. "You think it was them? The men who shot me?" Jake nodded grimly. "It seems likely. The Reeves gang has a reputation for holding grudges. But why?" Abigail cried. "Callie never did anything to them except try to protect me. Some men view any challenge to their authority as an unforgivable offense," Jake said, his voice hardening. "Especially from a woman." Callie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "So what do we do now?" "We can't stay here indefinitely." "Why not?" The question came from Abigail, surprising both adults. "I mean, why can't we stay in Republic? Maybe find a different place to live?" Jake looked at her with gentle eyes. "It's not just about where you live, Miss Abigail. Republic is a small town. As long as those men are free and holding a grudge, neither of you will be truly safe there." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Callie felt a wave of despair wash over her. In the months since their parents' deaths, she had worked so hard to build a stable life for herself and Abigail. Now, in the span of a single violent moment, everything they had accomplished was being stripped away. "We could go back east," Abigail suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. They both knew they had nothing and no one to return to in the east. Callie shook her head. "No, we made our choice to come west. I won't be driven away by fear." She turned to Jake, straightening her shoulders despite the twinge of pain the movement caused. "There must be somewhere else we could go. Perhaps one of the larger settlements where we might find work and disappear into the crowd." Jake considered her words, his expression thoughtful. "There are options. Spokane Falls is growing rapidly. Seattle too, though it's quite a journey from here. But before you make any decisions—" He hesitated, then seemed to come to a resolution. "I have a proposition for you." Callie raised an eyebrow, curious despite her distress. "My ranch is doing well, but it needs a woman's touch. Mrs. Hendricks does what she can, but she has the foreman's house and her own family to care for." He met Callie's gaze directly. "I could use a housekeeper, someone to manage the domestic affairs of the main house, prepare meals, keep accounts. The position would come with room and board for both you and your sister, as well as a fair wage." Callie blinked in surprise. "You're offering me a job here?" Jake nodded. "The ranch is far enough from town to be secure, and my men are loyal. You'd be safe here, at least until the Reeves gang is apprehended or moves on to cause trouble elsewhere." It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Callie studied Jake's face, searching for any hidden motive, but found only sincere concern. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked softly. "You barely know us." Something flickered in Jake's eyes, a pain or memory that was quickly masked. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to have your life upended by violence. And—" he glanced at Abigail, then back to Callie. "I admire your courage. Not many would put themselves in harm's way as you did for your sister." The compliment warmed Callie unexpectedly. "May I have some time to consider your offer?" "Of course." Jake stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Take all the time you need. You're welcome here regardless of your decision." As he gathered the dishes, Callie caught Abigail watching him with a speculative expression that made her slightly uneasy. Her sister had always been a romantic at heart, seeing potential matches where none existed. The last thing Callie needed was for Abigail to develop some fanciful notion about their rescuer. Later that night, as Callie sat on the edge of her bed brushing her hair, a task still painful but manageable with her good arm, Abigail slipped into the room and sat beside her. "I think you should accept his offer," she said without preamble. Callie sighed. "It's not that simple, Abby." "Why not? We need somewhere safe to stay, and he needs help with the house. It makes perfect sense." "And when the danger passes, what then?" Callie set down the brush and turned to face her sister. "We'd be dependent on him, living in his home." "We could save our wages," Abigail countered. "Build up enough to start fresh somewhere else when the time is right." Callie had to admit the logic was sound. Still, something held her back, perhaps pride, or the uncomfortable awareness that Jake Sutton stirred something in her that went beyond gratitude. "He's a good man, Callie," Abigail said softly, seeming to read her thoughts. "And he looks at you sometimes when you're not watching. Like he sees something special." "Don't be fanciful," Callie admonished, though her cheeks warmed. "Mr. Sutton is simply being kind to two women in unfortunate circumstances, nothing more." Abigail looked unconvinced but didn't press the issue. Well, whatever you decide, I'll support you. I just want us to be safe. I know, Abby. Callie pulled her sister into a one-armed hug. Get some sleep now, I'll think about it. After Abigail left, Callie moved to the window and looked out at the moonlit landscape of the Double S. Rolling pastures stretched toward distant hills, peaceful and seemingly far removed from the violence that had brought them here. In the paddock near the barn, she could see a figure moving among the horses. Jake, she realized, tending to his animals even after a long day's work. There was something about him that intrigued her. He wasn't like the rough-hewn cowboys or opportunistic miners that populated most of Republic. There was a quietness to him, a sense of having seen much of life and its hardships. And yet, despite whatever shadows lurked in his past, he had opened his home to two strangers without hesitation. As she watched him move with easy confidence among the horses, Callie made her decision. They would stay, at least until she was fully healed and the threat had passed. It was the practical choice, the safe choice. And if she felt a small thrill at the thought of getting to know Jake Sutton better, well, that was something she would keep to herself. The next morning, Callie found Jake in his study, poring over a ledger. He looked up as she knocked lightly on the open door, his expression immediately concerned. "Should you be up and about so much?" he asked, rising from his chair. Callie smiled. "Dr. Wilson said moderate activity would be good for me, remember, as long as I don't overexert myself." Jake nodded, though he still looked skeptical. "What can I do for you, Miss Everett?" "I've considered your offer," she said, stepping further into the room. It was a masculine space with leather-bound books lining one wall and a large desk dominating the center. A rifle hung over the stone fireplace, and maps of the territory were spread across a side table. "If it still stands, I'd like to accept the position as your housekeeper." Relief flickered across his features before his expression settled into something more neutral. "I'm glad to hear it." "The offer certainly still stands. I have a few conditions," Callie added, raising her chin slightly. A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Of course you do. Please go on." "First, I expect to earn my keep. Once my shoulder is fully healed, I want no special treatment. I'll work the same hours as any housekeeper would." "Agreed, though I hope you'll be sensible about your recovery." "Second, Abigail needs to continue her education. She's 16 and quite bright. If there's a school nearby or perhaps someone who could tutor her." Jake leaned against his desk, considering. "There's a schoolhouse in town, but given the circumstances, that might not be wise just yet. However, I have a fair collection of books, and I was educated back east before the war. I could provide some instruction until other arrangements can be made." Callie looked at him with newfound respect. "You were a teacher?" "No, but I studied at Harvard before enlisting. Literature, history, some mathematics. Enough to keep your sister's mind active, at least." Callie hadn't expected that Harvard was a far cry from the cattle ranges of Washington Territory. Jake Sutton was becoming more intriguing by the day. "That would be most appreciated," she said. "My final condition is that this arrangement be temporary. Once the danger has passed and I've saved enough, Abigail and I will move on and establish ourselves independently." Something that might have been disappointment crossed Jake's face, but it was gone so quickly Callie thought she might have imagined it. "I understand. Though you should know that you're both welcome here for as long as you wish to stay." "Thank you," Callie said softly, "for everything." Jake moved toward her, stopping when just a few feet separated them. This close, she could see flecks of blue in his gray eyes and the tiny lines at their corners that suggested he smiled more often than she'd yet witnessed. "There's something I should tell you," he said, his voice lower now, "about why I was so quick to help you that day in town." Callie waited, curious. "I recognized those men immediately. The Reeves gang killed my wife 2 years ago. The admission hit Callie like a physical blow. Your wife. I'm so sorry, I didn't know you were a widower, he finished for her. Yes. Eliza and I had come west to start fresh after the war. We had this ranch just over a year when the gang came through. They wanted horses, supplies, when she resisted. His jaw tightened. I was out checking fence lines. By the time I got back, it was too late. Callie's heart ached for him. That's why you knew so much about them. Why you were so certain they'd come back. Jake nodded. They operate across the territories, moving whenever the law gets too close. When I saw them in town that day, recognized pockmarked Pete. His hands clenched into fists. I was too late to stop them from hurting you, but I couldn't let them take another life. Not if I could help it. The weight of his confession hung between them. Callie understood now why he had been so determined to protect them, why he had opened his home without hesitation. It wasn't just kindness, it was a chance to right a wrong, to save lives when he couldn't save the one that mattered most. Did they ever face justice? For what they did to your wife? She asked gently. Jake shook his head, a muscle working in his jaw. No. The territorial marshals have been after them for years, but the gang always stays one step ahead. That's why I want you and your sister to stay here, where I can ensure your safety. Callie reached out impulsively, touching his arm. We'll stay, and I'm truly sorry about Eliza. His eyes met hers, filled with a gratitude that needed no words. For a moment, they stood connected by shared understanding of loss and the determination to move forward despite it. Then Jake stepped back, clearing his throat. Well then, it seems we have an arrangement, Miss Everett. He offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Callie shook it. We do indeed, Mr. Sutton. And so Callie and Abigail Everett became residents of the Double S Ranch, their lives intertwining with Jake Sutton's in ways none of them could have anticipated. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to life on the Double S. As Callie's shoulder healed, she gradually took on more household responsibilities, learning the layout of the spacious ranch house and establishing her own systems for its management. Mrs. Hendricks proved an invaluable guide during the transition, showing Callie where supplies were kept, introducing her to the ranch hands, and sharing the peculiarities of running a household so far from town. Abigail, meanwhile, flourished under Jake's tutelage. 3 evenings a week, they would gather in his study after supper, where he would guide her through lessons in literature, mathematics, and history. Callie often joined them, ostensibly to further her own education, but increasingly because she enjoyed watching the interaction between her sister and their host. Jake revealed himself to be a patient teacher with a deep knowledge of the classics and a surprising passion for poetry. When Abigail struggled with a particularly difficult mathematical concept, he never showed frustration, instead finding new ways to explain until understanding dawned in her eyes. You're good with her, Callie remarked one evening as they watched Abigail cross the yard toward the foreman's house, where she had been invited to join Mrs. Hendricks' daughter for an evening of music. Jake smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. She's eager to learn. That makes teaching a pleasure rather than a chore. They stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The air was cooling as summer began its gradual transition toward autumn, carrying the scent of pine and sage from the surrounding wilderness. Did you always want to be a rancher? Callie asked, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Jake chuckled. Hardly. My father was a banker in Boston. He expected me to follow in his footsteps. Harvard, then the family business. What changed? The war, mainly. His expression grew distant. After what I saw, what I did, The idea of spending my days behind a desk counting other men's money seemed intolerable. He glanced at her. Eliza was the one who suggested we go west. She had family in St. Louis, so we started there. But she had the same restlessness I did. We kept moving, following opportunity, until we found this place. Callie nodded, understanding. My parents never left Philadelphia until they died. Sometimes I wonder what they would think of Abigail and me now, so far from everything they knew. They would be proud, Jake said with conviction. You've shown remarkable strength and courage. Have I? Callie leaned against the porch railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Most days I feel like I'm simply doing what must be done, making the best choices I can from limited options. That's what courage is, Jake said softly. Not fearlessness, but continuing despite the fear. Callie turned to look at him, struck by the insight. In the golden light of sunset with his guard lowered, Jake Sutton was undeniably handsome. The realization sent a flutter of something through her chest that she quickly tried to suppress. What about you? She asked, deliberately changing the subject. Is ranching what you hoped it would be? A smile tugged at his lips. Most days, though I could do without the drought seasons and the cattle rustlers. Have you had trouble with rustlers? Jake shook his head. Not recently. The brand of the double S is well respected in these parts, and my men are vigilant. He straightened, seeming to remember himself. Speaking of which, I should check on that new foal before it gets too dark. Excuse me. As he strode toward the barn, Callie watched him go, aware of a growing warmth in her heart whenever she was in his company. It was dangerous, she knew. She was his employee, nothing more, and he was still grieving a wife he had clearly loved deeply. Whatever attraction she might feel was inappropriate, and surely one-sided. And yet, as the days passed, she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested he might be fighting similar feelings. When their hands accidentally touched while passing dishes at supper, neither was quick to pull away. When she laughed at something Abigail said, his eyes would linger on her face a moment longer than necessary. It was Mrs. Hendricks who first named the unspoken current between them. The older woman found Callie in the kitchen one afternoon, teaching Abigail how to make apple pie with fruit from the small orchard behind the house. You're good for him, you know, she said without preamble, nodding toward the window where Jake could be seen talking with his foreman. Callie felt heat rise to her cheeks. I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Hendricks snorted, clearly not fooled. That man has been walking through life half dead since he lost Eliza. First time I've seen real life in his eyes again is when he looks at you. Mrs. Hendricks, Callie protested. Mr. Sutton is my employer, nothing more, MMHMM. The woman's knowing smile made Callie flush deeper. You keep telling yourself that, dear. Meanwhile, the rest of us have eyes. Before Callie could formulate a response, Abigail spoke up. I've noticed it too. He smiles more when you're in the room. Both of you stop, Callie said firmly, though her heart had begun to race. Even if there were feelings, which there aren't, nothing could come of it. We're leaving as soon as it's safe to do so. That was our agreement. Mrs. Hendricks shrugged. Agreements can change. Life has a way of revealing what we truly want if we're brave enough to see it. The conversation left Callie unsettled for days afterward. She found herself watching Jake more closely, searching for signs that what Mrs. Hendricks had said might be true. Was there really something in the way he looked at her? Did his smile come more easily in her presence? More disturbingly, she began to question her own determination to leave as soon as possible. The double S was becoming home in a way their cabin in town never had. Abigail was thriving under Jake's tutelage and Mrs. Hendricks' motherly attention. And Callie herself had found a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded her since their parents' deaths. But what did Jake want? He had offered them shelter out of a sense of duty, and perhaps to assuage the guilt of not being able to save his wife from the same men who had hurt Callie. That didn't mean he wanted her to stay permanently. These thoughts occupied her mind one crisp September morning as she rode beside Jake toward town. It was her first trip back to Republic since the shooting, and despite Jake's assurances about the Reeves gang having moved on, she felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "We don't have to do this today," Jake said, noticing her tension. "The supplies can wait." Callie shook her head, straightening in the saddle. "No, I need to face this. I won't let fear rule my life." Pride flickered in his eyes. "You're one of the strongest women I've ever known, Callie Everett." The use of her first name rare for him, despite her insistence that formality was unnecessary between them, sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Not so strong," she admitted. "I'm glad you're with me." They rode into town side by side, drawing curious glances from the townsfolk who had heard rumors about the Eastern woman staying at the Sutton ranch. Callie held her head high, determined not to show how her heart raced at returning to the spot where she'd nearly lost her life. As they passed the general store, she couldn't help but glance at the place where she had fallen. There was no sign now of what had happened, no bloodstain, no marker, nothing to indicate that a life had nearly ended on that patch of dirt. "Are you all right?" Jake asked quietly, reining his horse closer to hers. "Yes," she replied, surprised to find it was true. "It's strange, I expected to feel more, something, fear perhaps, but it's just a place now." "That's good," he said. "The memories lose their power when we face them." They completed their errands, efficiently collecting mail, purchasing supplies that couldn't be produced on the ranch, and meeting briefly with the town's doctor to check Callie's healing shoulder. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to head back to the Double S. As Jake secured their purchases to the pack horses, the territorial marshal approached, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Sutton," he greeted with a nod. "Miss Everett, good to see you recovered." "Thank you, Marshal Davis," Callie replied. "Have there been any developments regarding the men who shot me?" The marshal exchanged a look with Jake before answering. "Actually, yes. That's why I wanted to catch you before you headed back. We got word yesterday that the Reeves gang was involved in a bank robbery over in Idaho. There was a shootout with the local law." "Were they apprehended?" Jake asked, his voice tense. "Two were killed, including the leader fellow goes by pockmarked Pete. The others scattered, but the Idaho authorities have good leads. They think they'll have them all in custody within the week." The news hit Callie with unexpected force. She had carried the fear of these men for so long that the possibility of it ending seemed almost unreal. "You're certain?" she pressed. "About the leader," Marshal Davis nodded. "Got a telegraph with the description. It's him all right." Seems his luck finally ran out. Jake's hand found Callie's elbow, steadying her though she hadn't realized she was swaying. "That's welcome news, Marshal. Thank you for letting us know." The marshal tipped his hat. "Figured you'd want to hear as soon as possible." "Miss Everett, you should be able to return to town safely now if you wish." After he walked away, Callie and Jake stood in silence, absorbing the implications of the news. The threat that had brought them together was apparently ending. The agreement they had made that Callie and Abigail would stay only until it was safe had reached its natural conclusion. "Well," Callie said finally, her voice not quite steady, "it seems Abigail and I can begin making arrangements to leave the Double S." Jake's expression was unreadable as he adjusted the cinch on his saddle. "There's no rush," he said without looking at her. "Winter's coming. It might be prudent to wait until spring before making any significant changes." Hope fluttered in Callie's chest. Was he looking for reasons to keep them at the ranch? Or was it simply practical concern for their welfare? "That's sensible," she agreed, trying to keep her tone neutral. And it would give Abigail more time with her studies. Jake nodded, finally meeting her eyes. Something smoldered there, something that made her breath catch. And it would give us more time as well. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Callie wasn't sure how to respond, what to say that wouldn't reveal too much of her own confused feelings. Before she could form a reply, a shot rang out, shattering the moment. Jake reacted instantly, pulling Callie behind the shelter of a water trough as another bullet splintered the wood where they had been standing. "What's happening?" Callie gasped, her heart pounding as the sounds of shouting and more gunfire filled the street. "Bank robbery," Jake replied grimly, drawing his revolver. "Stay down. I'm going to get us out of here." Peering cautiously around the trough, Callie could see 4 men on horseback in front of the Republic Bank. 2 were firing at the marshal and his deputies, who had taken cover behind a wagon, while the others were loading saddlebags with what must have been the bank's money. With horror, she recognized one of the men, not the leader with the pockmarked face, but one of his companions who had been there the day she was shot. "Jake," she whispered urgently. "Those men, they're part of the Reeves gang." His expression hardened. The marshal's information must have been wrong or incomplete. He checked his gun, his movements precise and controlled. "We need to get to our horses and out of town. But if they see us, we have no choice. Once they finish at the bank, they'll be looking to escape. We need to be gone before then." Callie nodded, gathering her courage. Their horses were tethered just 20 feet away near the general store. If they could reach them undetected, they might have a chance. "On my signal," Jake said, his eyes scanning the street. "Stay low and move fast. I'll be right behind you." When a particularly loud exchange of gunfire drew everyone's attention toward the bank, Jake squeezed her hand. "Now," Callie ran, keeping low as Jake had instructed. She was halfway to the horses when one of the outlaws turned and spotted her. "Well, look who it is," he shouted. "The girl who don't know her place." Time seemed to slow as he raised his pistol. Callie froze, certain she was about to die. Then Jake was there, firing rapidly as he pushed her behind him. The outlaw's shot went wild as one of Jake's bullets caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. "Get on your horse," Jake commanded, continuing to fire as the other outlaws turned their attention toward them. Callie scrambled onto her mount, terror making her movements clumsy. Jake swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease, still firing with one hand as he grabbed her reins with the other. "Ride," he shouted, kicking his horse into motion. They thundered out of town, bullets whistling past them. Callie bent low over her horse's neck, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind them, she could hear hoofbeats, the outlaws in pursuit. Jake led them off the main road, cutting across open country toward a line of trees in the distance. "They know who you are," he called over the sound of their horses' hooves. "They'll follow us back to the ranch if they can." Fear surged through Callie, not just for herself, but for Abigail, waiting unsuspecting at the Double S. "What do? We lose them," Jake said grimly. "Or we fight." The trees ahead were the beginning of a dense forest that covered the foothills leading up to the mountains. As they reached its edge, Jake pulled his horse to a stop in a small clearing. "Dismount," he ordered. "Quickly." Callie obeyed, watching in confusion as Jake drew his rifle from its scabbard. "What are you doing?" Creating a diversion. He slapped her horse hard on the rump, sending it galloping deeper into the forest, then did the same with his own. "With luck, they'll follow the horses and give us time to double back." "Double back? But the ranch is the other way." "We can't lead them to Abigail," Jake said, taking her hand and pulling her into the cover of the trees. "We need to circle around, approach from a different direction." They moved as quickly as they could through the underbrush, Jake leading with his rifle ready. In the distance, Callie could hear their pursuers entering the forest, shouting to each other as they followed the sound of the fleeing horses. "They took the bait," Jake murmured. "But we need to keep moving. They'll realize the trick soon enough." For what seemed like hours, they made their way through the forest, always alert for signs of pursuit. The sun was beginning to set, painting the woods in deepening shadows that made progress even more difficult. Callie's injured shoulder, though largely healed, had begun to ache from the exertion and tension. "Jake," she said finally, her voice betraying her exhaustion, "I need to rest, just for a moment." He looked back at her, concern replacing the vigilant focus that had marked his features. "Of course." "I'm sorry, I should have realized." They found a fallen log and Callie sank onto it gratefully. Jake knelt before her, examining her face in the fading light. "Are you all right? Did your wound reopen?" She shook her head. "No, just sore and frightened." She looked up at him, the reality of their situation crashing over her. "Those men recognized me. They'll come after us after Abigail." "I won't let that happen," Jake said, his voice low and fierce. He took her hands in his, and she was surprised to find them warm despite the cooling evening air. "I promise you, Callie, I will keep you both safe." Something in his tone, in the intensity of his gaze, made her breath catch. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk so much for us?" For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his eyes revealing emotions he had kept carefully hidden until now. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "Because I can't lose you," he said softly. "Either of you. You and Abigail, you've brought life back to my home, to me. The thought of you leaving has been." He shook his head, searching for words. "I've been making excuses, finding reasons to ask you to stay longer. But the truth is, I don't want you to go. Ever." Callie's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. Jake, before she could continue, the crack of a twig breaking nearby sent them both to alert. Jake was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, positioning himself between Callie and the potential threat. "Well, ain't this touching?" drawled a voice from the gathering darkness. "The lady and her knight." Two men emerged from the trees, guns drawn. Callie recognized them both from that day in town. The one Jake had shot in the shoulder was bleeding heavily, his face pale beneath the dirt and stubble. The other was grinning, clearly enjoying their predicament. "Seems like we got separated from our friends," the wounded one said, his voice strained but still menacing. "But look what we found instead. The woman who caused me to get shot, twice now." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. "You take one more step and it'll be the last thing you ever do." The outlaw laughed, though it ended in a grimace of pain. "Big words from a man outnumbered. Even wounded, there's two of us and one of you. And unlike you," Jake said coldly, "I don't miss." For a tense moment, no one moved. Callie held her breath, certain that violence was about to erupt. Then, unexpectedly, the wounded outlaw lowered his gun slightly. "Look, mister, we don't even know you, our quarrels with the woman. She made us look bad in front of the whole town. Pete said we couldn't let that stand." "Pete is dead," Jake replied. "The marshal told us. Shot during a bank robbery in Idaho." The two men exchanged looks. "That true?" the second outlaw asked his companion. "Don't know. We got separated a week back, was supposed to meet up again in Republic." Jake's stance remained unwavering. "The gang is finished. Two dead, the rest about to be captured. You can either die here or you can take your chances elsewhere. But if you choose to come after this woman again, if you so much as think about her or her sister, I will hunt you down. And I promise, it won't be quick." There was something in Jake's voice that made even Callie shiver, a deadly certainty that left no room for doubt. The outlaws must have felt it too, because the uninjured one began backing away slowly. "Come on, Lloyd. We got the money from the bank. Let's get while we can." The wounded man, Lloyd, hesitated, his eyes burning with hatred as he stared at Callie. "This ain't over," he spat. "It is," Jake said with quiet menace. "One way or another, it ends tonight." For a heartbeat, Callie thought Lloyd would fire despite the odds. Then, with a final venomous glare, he backed away into the darkness after his companion. Jake waited until the sound of their retreat had faded before lowering his rifle slightly. "They could be circling around," he said, his voice tight. "We need to move." Callie stood, her legs shaky but determined. "Do you think they'll really leave?" "I don't know, but I'm not willing to bet your life on it." He checked his rifle, then turned to her with an expression that combined tenderness and resolve. "What I said before I meant it. But we can talk about that once you're safe." Callie nodded, warmth spreading through her despite the danger. "Let's go home then." They moved through the darkening forest with renewed purpose, Jake setting a pace that was challenging but manageable. The route he chose was circuitous, designed to throw off any potential pursuers while gradually bringing them back toward the Double S. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the edge of the ranch's property. In the distance, Callie could see lights burning in the main house and the bunkhouse ordinary, comforting signs of life continuing despite the drama unfolding elsewhere. "We should approach carefully," Jake murmured, "if they did somehow get ahead of us." But his caution proved unnecessary. As they drew closer, they could see several of the ranch hands patrolling the grounds, rifles at the ready. One spotted them and gave a shout, bringing Mrs. Hendricks and Abigail rushing onto the porch. "Callie!" Abigail cried, flying down the steps and across the yard. She threw herself into her sister's arms, nearly knocking her over. "When the horses came back without you, we feared the worst." Callie held her tightly, relief washing over her. "We're all right, Abby. Everything's going to be all right now." Over her sister's shoulder, she met Jake's eyes. The expression in them relief, tenderness, and something deeper that made her heart race told her that her words were true. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Later that night, after the excitement had died down and Abigail had finally been persuaded to go to bed, Callie and Jake sat before the fire in his study. A bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses stood on the table between them, though neither had drunk much. The events of the day had left them too keyed up for alcohol. "The marshal sent word while you were washing up," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence. "They caught the 2 outlaws about 5 miles from here, heading for the territorial border." Callie released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "So it's really over this time." "It seems so." He studied her face in the firelight. "How are you feeling?" "Truly grateful," she said simply. "To be alive, to be here." She hesitated, then added softly, "to be with you." Jake set his glass down and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. The proximity sent her pulse racing, but she didn't pull away. "What you said in the forest," she began, finding courage in the warmth of his gaze. "About not wanting us to leave." "I meant every word," he said, taking her hand in his. "These past months, watching you heal, seeing your strength and grace, you've awakened something in me I thought died with Eliza." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm. "I know it hasn't been long. I know there are complications, but I care for you, Callie, deeply." The sincerity in his voice made tears spring to her eyes. "I care for you too," she whispered. "More than I should, perhaps." "Why shouldn't you?" he asked, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Because I'm your employee. Because your heart still belongs to Eliza. Because I was afraid to admit, even to myself, how much I've come to need you." Jake's expression softened. "My heart will always hold a place for Eliza. But she's gone, and I've learned that the heart can expand to love again without diminishing what came before." He leaned closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "As for being my employee, that arrangement can easily change if you want it to." Callie's breath caught. "What are you saying, Jake?" "I'm saying that life is too precious and too uncertain to waste time denying what we feel." His hand cupped her cheek, his touch gentle yet sure. "I'm asking if you and Abigail would consider staying, not as my housekeeper and her charge, but as my family." The words hung in the air between them, filled with promise and possibility. Callie searched his face, finding only sincerity and a vulnerability that matched her own. "It's too soon," she said softly, though her heart was racing. "We've known each other such a short time." "Is it?" Jake's thumb brushed over her lips, sending a tremor through her. "Sometimes a few months can teach you more about a person than years of ordinary acquaintance. Crisis reveals character, Callie, and everything I've seen of yours only makes me more certain." He was right, she realized. The circumstances of their meeting, the shared dangers and quiet moments of healing that followed, they had created a bond more profound than many relationships built over years of peaceful coexistence. "What about Abigail?" she asked, practical concerns intruding despite the magic of the moment. "She's still young, and I'm responsible for her future." Jake smiled. "Abigail has been dropping hints for weeks that she thinks we're perfect for each other. I believe she'd be delighted." His expression grew more serious. "But if you need time, if you're not ready, I understand. I'll wait, Callie. However long it takes." The tenderness in his voice was her undoing. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of responsibility for Abigail, for their survival. The prospect of sharing that burden, of being cherished and protected by this good, strong man, it was overwhelming in the most wonderful way. "I don't need time," she whispered. "I just needed to know you were sure." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, brilliant and full of promise. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. But as Callie responded, her arms sliding around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of passion long suppressed, and now finally free to express itself. His hand cradled the back of her head, fingers tangling in her hair, while his other arm wrapped around her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Callie Everett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have since the moment I saw you stand up to those men to protect your sister." Tears of joy spilled down Callie's cheeks. "And I love you, Jake Sutton, more than I ever thought possible." Outside, the night was peaceful, stars shining down on the Double S Ranch, where an unexpected journey had brought two wounded souls together, healing them in ways neither could have anticipated when a single act of violence changed the course of their lives. As spring bloomed across the hills and valleys surrounding the Double S Ranch, preparations for a wedding were underway. The main house had been transformed. Wildflowers in glass jars adorned every surface, white ribbons festooned the porch railings, and the delicious smells of Mrs. Hendrick's cooking wafted from the kitchen where she supervised an army of helpers. In the guest bedroom, which had once been her sick room, Callie stood before a mirror while Abigail fussed with her hair. The dress she wore was simple but elegant, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, ordered specially from Seattle for the occasion. "You look beautiful," Abigail said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. At 16, she had blossomed over the winter, growing from a girl into a young woman with dreams of her own. "Jake won't be able to speak when he sees you." Callie smiled, touching the small locket that had been her mother's, something old to complement the new dress. "Are you sure you're happy about this, Abby? It changes things for you too." Abigail laughed, the sound bright and carefree. "Happy? Callie, I've never been happier. Jake is wonderful. The ranch feels more like home than anywhere we've ever lived, and She hesitated, then continued with a hint of shyness. Jake says that once I finish my studies, he'll support me if I want to apply to the women's college in Seattle. He told you that? Callie hadn't heard this particular conversation. Abigail nodded. Last week when you were in town with Mrs. Hendricks. He said that education was important and that while he'd miss me terribly, he and you would be proud to see me pursue my dreams. Tears pricked at Callie's eyes. Just when she thought she couldn't love Jake Sutton more, he found new ways to prove how exceptional he was. That sounds like him, she said softly. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Hendricks peeked in, her round face flushed with excitement. It's time, dears. Everyone's gathered and that man of yours is looking like he might wear a hole in the floorboards with his pacing. Callie took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over the silk of her dress. Then we shouldn't keep him waiting. The ceremony took place on the sprawling front porch of the Double S, with the breathtaking vista of mountains and meadows serving as a natural cathedral. Nearly everyone in Republic had made the journey to the ranch, along with neighboring settlers and all the hands who worked the property. Jake stood waiting with the minister from town, his usual ranch attire replaced by a crisp black suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and tall frame. When Callie appeared in the doorway, Abigail at her side, a hush fell over the assembled guests. Jake's eyes found hers, and the naked adoration in them made her steps falter momentarily. Abigail squeezed her arm, a silent reassurance, and together they walked toward the man who had changed both their lives irrevocably. "You are breathtaking," Jake whispered as she reached him, taking her hands in his. The minister smiled kindly at them before beginning the ceremony. As Callie repeated her vows, promising to love and honor Jake for all the days of her life, she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with violence and fear had transformed into the deepest love she had ever known. When Jake slipped the gold band onto her finger crafted by the town jeweler using gold from his own claim near Republic, his hands were steady, his eyes clear with certainty. And when he kissed her after the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers of the guests seemed distant compared to the roaring of joy in her own heart. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing in the yard to the music of fiddles and banjos, abundant food and drink, and the kind of genuine community spirit that could only be found on the frontier. As twilight descended, Jake found Callie sitting on the porch steps, taking a moment's respite from the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, settling beside her and taking her hand. "Beyond words," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "Though I must admit, I'm looking forward to when everyone leaves and it's just us." A slow smile spread across his face. "Mrs. Hendricks has arranged for Abigail to stay with her tonight to give us some privacy." Callie felt heat rise in her cheeks. Though they had shared many heated embraces during their engagement, Jake had been determined to honor tradition by waiting until they were properly wed. The anticipation had been both sweet and maddening. "Good," she whispered, turning to press a kiss to his jaw. "Because I've been waiting a very long time to be alone with my husband." His arm tightened around her waist. "Not as long as I've been waiting for you, Callie Sutton." The sound of her new name on his lips sent a thrill through her. "Say that again," she requested. "Callie Sutton," he repeated, his voice dropping to a tone that made her shiver despite the warm evening air. "My wife, my heart." Later, when the last guests had departed and the ranch was silent save for the distant sounds of night creatures, Jake and Callie stood in the master bedroom, now their bedroom, facing each other with a mixture of nervousness and desire. "I've never," Callie began, then stopped, embarrassed. Jake stepped closer, taking her face between his hands with infinite tenderness. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her. "Tonight and every night hereafter." His kiss was gentle at first, then increasingly passionate as the barriers between them fell away. In the soft glow of lamplight, they discovered each other fully at last, their bodies joining as their hearts already had. Afterward, lying in his arms as the moon cast silver patterns through the window, Callie felt a peace she had never known. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear. His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, more than I have words to express." As she drifted toward sleep, surrounded by his warmth and the promise of all the days to come, Callie reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. A single act of violence, a sister protected, a bullet that might have ended her life but instead had begun a new one. It seemed impossible that something so beautiful could emerge from such dark beginnings. Yet here she was, in the arms of the man who had stopped her bleeding and carried her to safety, who had offered shelter when they had nowhere else to turn, who had gradually healed her body and her heart with his steady strength and unexpected tenderness. Life on the frontier was unpredictable, sometimes harsh, but also filled with moments of extraordinary beauty and connection. As Jake's breathing deepened into sleep beside her, Callie made a silent vow to cherish every moment of the life they would build together, she and Jake and Abigail, and perhaps someday, God willing, children of their own to fill the rooms of the Double S with laughter. Outside their window, the vast wilderness of Washington territory stretched toward the horizon, wild and free. But within these walls, within the circle of Jake's arms, Callie had found something even more precious than freedom. She had found home. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Jake Sutton sat on the porch of the Double S, cradling his 6-month-old son while watching his wife hang laundry in the yard. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly ordinary, that sometimes he had to remind himself it was real and not some dream his lonely heart had conjured. William James Sutton, named for both their fathers, was a sturdy baby with Callie's green eyes and Jake's determined chin. From the moment of his birth, following a difficult but ultimately successful labor, he had been the center of their world. Even Abigail, home from her first year at the Women's College in Seattle, was utterly besotted with her nephew, spending hours reading to him from her textbooks, as if he could understand the principles of mathematics and natural philosophy. "He's getting heavy," Callie observed, approaching the porch with a basket of dry linens. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and a healthy flush colored her cheeks from the exertion of her chores. To Jake, she had never looked more beautiful. "He is," Jake agreed, standing to kiss her lightly. "Takes after his mother, strong and growing stronger every day." Callie smiled, setting down her basket to touch their son's downy head. "Mrs. Hendricks says he'll be walking before we know it." Apparently, her grandson was taking steps at 9 months. "Let's not rush him," Jake said, only half joking. The idea of his son growing up too quickly made him wistful. He had missed so much in the years before Callie and Abigail had come into his life, years spent in grief and solitude. Now, he wanted to savor every moment. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. A cloud of dust announced visitors well before they could make out who was coming. "Are we expecting anyone?" Callie asked, reflexively taking William from Jake's arms. Though the Reeves gang was long gone, its members either dead or imprisoned, and the territory had grown more settled in recent years, old habits of caution died hard. Jake shook his head, already moving toward the gun rack inside the door. "No, stay here while I see who it is." But his precaution proved unnecessary. As the riders drew closer, Abigail's voice called out from inside the house. "It's Dr. Wilson and Marshall Davis. Relief replaced tension as Jake recognized their visitors. Dr. Wilson had become a friend over the years, attending William's birth and treating the occasional injuries that came with ranch life. Marshal Davis, though not a frequent visitor, was always welcome for the news he brought from beyond Republic. "Sutton," the marshal greeted as they dismounted. "Mrs. Sutton, hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Callie replied warmly. "Please come in. I'll put on some coffee." Inside, once William had been admired appropriately and refreshments served, the real purpose of their visit emerged. "I've received some news I thought you should hear directly from me," Marshal Davis said, setting down his coffee cup. "Lloyd Reeves died in prison last week." Jake felt Callie stiffen beside him. Lloyd had been the last remaining member of the gang who had directly threatened them, the wounded man who had confronted them in the forest that night. He had been captured trying to flee to Canada and sentenced to 20 years for his role in multiple robberies and shootings. "How?" Jake asked. "Consumption, according to the prison doctor. Been sick for months, apparently." The marshal's eyes were kind as he looked at Callie. "Thought you might want to know that chapter is well and truly closed now." Callie nodded, her hand finding Jake's. "Thank you for telling us," she said quietly. After the visitors had departed, promising to return for Sunday dinner, Jake found Callie in the nursery, watching William sleep in his cradle. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest with a sigh. "You all right?" he murmured against her hair. "Yes," she said, turning in his embrace to face him. "It's strange I hadn't thought about Lloyd Reeves in months, hearing he's dead. I don't feel satisfaction or relief, just a kind of sadness that a life could go so wrong." Jake nodded, understanding. It was one of the countless things he loved about his wife, her capacity for compassion, even toward those who had harmed her. "You have a generous heart, Callie Sutton." She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the peace she had found. "I have a full heart. It's hard to hold onto anger when I have so much to be thankful for." As they stood together in the quiet nursery, their sleeping son a testament to the life they had built from adversity, Jake marveled again at the journey that had brought them here. From that bloody day in Republic to this moment of contentment, they had weathered storms both literal and figurative, emerging stronger for having faced them together. Outside, the Double S Ranch continued to thrive under their joint stewardship. New buildings had been added, the herd had grown, and their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock had spread throughout the territory. The wilderness remained, beautiful and sometimes dangerous, but they had carved out a place of safety and prosperity within it. More precious than any material success, however, was the family they had formed. Abigail was flourishing at school, discovering a passion for teaching that would likely bring her back to the frontier where educators were desperately needed. William was healthy and strong, the first of what they hoped would be several children to fill the house with joy and purpose. And at the center of it all was the love between them, a love forged in crisis, tempered by challenges, and now flourishing in the peace they had earned together. "What are you thinking?" Callie asked, noting his thoughtful expression. Jake smiled, pulling her closer. "I was thinking about the day we met. How I never could have imagined when I was kneeling in the dust trying to stop your bleeding that you would become my whole world." "It's funny how life works," she said softly. "If I hadn't been shot defending Abigail, if I hadn't been there to help, if we hadn't needed somewhere safe to stay." They both fell silent, contemplating the chain of events that had brought them together, how what had seemed like tragedy had ultimately led to their greatest happiness. "I wouldn't change a moment," Callie said finally. "Not even the painful ones. They all led us here." Jake kissed her then, pouring all his love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, Breathless and smiling, he rested his forehead against hers in the intimate gesture that had become habitual between them. "I love you, Mrs. Sutton. And I love you, Mr. Sutton. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." In the cradle beside them, William stirred and cooed softly in his sleep, secure in the knowledge even in his infant consciousness that he was surrounded by love. Outside the window, the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Another day on the Double S was drawing to a close, but the story of the family who had found each other against all odds would continue, growing richer and deeper with each passing season. For Callie and Jake Sutton, what had begun with a gunshot and a desperate act of courage had transformed into a love story more beautiful and enduring than either could have imagined, a testament to the healing power of love in even the wildest places of the heart. 5 years after their wedding, the Double S Ranch had grown almost beyond recognition. What had once been Jake's solitary refuge was now a thriving community unto itself. A second house had been built for Abigail, who had returned from college to establish a small school for the children of neighboring ranchers and the ranch hands' families. The original bunkhouse had been expanded, the barn rebuilt larger after a lightning strike, and new corrals added to accommodate the growing herd. On a warm June morning, Callie stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake teaching their children to ride. William, now 5.5, sat proudly on his own pony, while 3-year-old Elizabeth perched in front of her father on his gentle mare. Their laughter drifted through the open window, making Callie smile as she absently rested a hand on her slightly rounded belly where their third child was just beginning to show. The territory had changed as much as their family. Washington was moving toward statehood, bringing more settlers, more law and order, more civilization to what had once been wild frontier. Republic had grown from a dusty mining town into a proper settlement with a church, a school, and even a small hotel for travelers. The threats they had once faced seemed distant now, like stories from another lifetime. Yet Callie never forgot how their story had begun with violence and fear that had somehow led to this abundance of love and security. She kept the dress she had been wearing when she was shot, the bloodstains still visible despite countless attempts to wash it out, folded in a trunk beneath their bed. Not as a morbid souvenir, but as a reminder of how precious and precarious life could be, and how a single moment of courage could alter its course forever. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Jake's voice interrupted her reverie as he entered the kitchen, Elizabeth drowsy in his arms and William trailing behind, chattering about his pony's exploits. Callie smiled, accepting a kiss from her husband. "Just counting my blessings," she replied, running a hand through William's tousled hair. "Which reminds me, Abigail mentioned that a new family has purchased the old Miller place. She thinks we should invite them for Sunday dinner, help them feel welcome." "Of course," Jake agreed, settling Elizabeth on a chair with a cookie. "What do we know about them? Not much." "A young couple with a baby. The husband plans to try his hand at sheep farming." Callie began gathering ingredients for the lunch she was preparing. "Apparently, they're from back east and don't know many people yet." Jake nodded, understanding the significance. He and Callie had made it a tradition to extend hospitality to newcomers, remembering their own early days in Republic. "I'll ride over tomorrow and issue the invitation personally." That Sunday, the Sutton household bustled with activity as they prepared to welcome their guests. The new neighbors James and Sarah Cooper and their infant daughter arrived just as Abigail was setting out the final dishes on the large dining table that had been moved to the porch to accommodate everyone. "Welcome to the Double S," Jake greeted, stepping forward to help Mrs. Cooper down from their wagon. "We're glad you could join us." The young couple looked slightly overwhelmed by the warmth of their reception. Mr. Cooper, barely out of his 20s with a scholarly look about him, shook Jake's hand firmly. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Sutton. We've heard a great deal about your family since arriving." "All good, I hope," Jake smiled, leading them toward the porch where Callie waited with the children. "Oh yes," Mrs. Cooper assured him, cradling her baby against her shoulder. "Everyone in town speaks very highly of the Suttons." Callie stepped forward to welcome them, but paused as she got her first clear look at Sarah Cooper. There was something hauntingly familiar about the young woman's face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. "Have we met before?" she asked, extending her hand. Mrs. Cooper shook her head, though she too seemed puzzled. "I don't believe so. We've only just arrived from Pennsylvania." "Pennsylvania," Callie repeated. "My parents were from Philadelphia." "Mine as well," Mrs. Cooper said, her eyes widening slightly. "What was your maiden name?" "Everett." "Callie Everett." Mrs. Cooper gasped, nearly dropping her baby. "Not Caroline Everett, daughter of William and Margaret?" Now it was Callie's turn to be shocked. No one had called her Caroline in years. She had been Callie for so long that her formal name sounded strange to her ears. "Yes, but how could you possibly know that?" Tears filled the younger woman's eyes. "My mother was Mary Everett, your father's sister, which would make us cousins." The revelation stunned Callie into momentary silence. Her father had rarely spoken of his family, having had a falling out with them years before Callie was born. She knew she had relatives somewhere, but had never expected to encounter them, especially not here in the far reaches of the Washington Territory. "I don't understand," she finally managed. "How did you find us?" Sarah shook her head, laughing through her tears. "We didn't. James accepted a position with the Territorial Land Office in Republic. We had no idea you were here until people in town started mentioning the Sutton family and the woman who had been shot defending her sister years ago." Her expression softened. "Mother always wondered what happened to you and Abigail after your parents passed. She tried to find you, but by the time she learned of their deaths, you had already left Philadelphia." Abigail, who had been listening to the exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. "You're our cousin, truly?" Sarah nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes. And this," she indicated the baby in her arms, "is Margaret, named for your mother, my aunt." The coincidence, or perhaps providence, of finding family in such a remote corner of the world left everyone momentarily speechless. Jake was the first to recover, clearing his throat and gesturing toward the table. "Well, this calls for a celebration. Please sit down. There's plenty of food and clearly much to discuss." The meal that followed was filled with the exchange of family histories, the piecing together of connections long forgotten or never known. Sarah explained that her mother had regretted the estrangement from her brother and had tried to reconcile before his death. When she learned that William's daughters had headed west, she had feared they were lost to the family forever. "And now here you are," Callie marveled, reaching across the table to squeeze her newfound cousin's hand. "It's as if the world isn't so vast after all. Or perhaps some connections are simply meant to be restored," Jake suggested, his eyes warm as he watched his wife absorbing this unexpected gift. Later, after the Coopers had departed with promises of frequent visits and shared holidays, Jake found Callie sitting on their bedroom balcony, gazing at the stars. He settled into the chair beside her, taking her hand in his. "Quite a day," he observed. "How are you feeling?" Callie turned to him, her eyes bright with wonder. "Like another piece of the puzzle has fallen into place. All these years, I thought Abigail and I were alone in the world except for each other, and now to discover family here of all places. The world works in mysterious ways, Jake said, kissing her fingers lightly. Though I confess I'm not entirely surprised. Oh, and why is that? He smiled, the expression tender in the moonlight. Because you, Callie Sutton, are a woman who draws people to her. You create family wherever you go, not just by birth or blood, but through that extraordinary heart of yours. He placed a hand gently on her growing belly. Our children are fortunate to have you as their mother, just as I am blessed to have you as my wife. Tears pricked at Callie's eyes. I love you, Jake, so much that sometimes I can't believe this is our life, that we found each other the way we did. I think about that day often, he admitted. How close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you, when I saw you fall in the street. He shook his head, the memory still painful despite the years that had passed. I've never moved so fast in my life, and when I reached you, saw how badly you were hurt, I made a promise to God right then and there. What promise? Callie asked softly. That if he let you live, I would dedicate my life to keeping you safe and making you happy. His voice was husky with emotion. It's a promise I intend to keep for all our days. Callie leaned across the space between their chairs to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, she kept her hand on his cheek, feeling the familiar stubble beneath her palm. You have kept that promise, my love, every day in countless ways. She smiled, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she felt for this man. And I make you a promise in return that I will love you with every breath, through whatever joys or trials life brings our way. In the soft summer night, surrounded by the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, they sat together in comfortable silence, hands entwined, contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The road had not always been easy. There had been droughts that threatened the herd, winters harsh enough to test even the sturdiest structures, and the normal challenges of building a life together. But through it all, they had faced each obstacle as they had from the beginning, side by side, drawing strength from each other and from the love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the years passed, the story of how they met became a favorite among their children and grandchildren. How Callie had been shot defending Abigail, how Jake had stopped the bleeding and gotten them both out of danger, and how that moment of crisis had led to a lifetime of love. It was a tale they never tired of hearing, each retelling reinforcing the family's understanding that courage and compassion were values worth any sacrifice. And on quiet evenings, when the house was still except for the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the clock, Callie and Jake would sometimes sit together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, and marvel at the twists of fate that had brought them together. How a single act of violence had led not to more pain and loss, but to healing, to family, to a love that grew stronger with each passing day. It was not the life either of them had envisioned in their youth. It was better, richer, deeper, more meaningful than any dream they could have crafted for themselves. A life built on the foundation of a moment's courage and a stranger's kindness, transformed through love into something beautiful and enduring. For Callie and Jake Sutton of the Double S Ranch, what had begun with a gunshot in a dusty street had become a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the healing power of compassion and the unexpected gifts that can emerge from even the darkest moments of our lives.